This chapter is divided into epithelial tissue and all the rest of the tissues. So I already had you learn and read on chapter 4 just for epithelial tissues and look at the epithelial tissues, how they look under the microscope, how they are differentiated by cell type and number of cell layers, and know basic key functions of epithelial tissue in general, and the functions of each of the 6 types of epithelial tissue that you need to know for your exam. This week we are looking at the rest of the tissues. So this is your connective tissue, muscular tissue, and your nervous tissue. So we're going to start with connective tissue, and we're going to go through all of the types of tissue here for this section. So the basic function, if you remember, of tissues is that they're a collection of cells that are going to work together for one similar function. So with your epithelial tissues, remember that the main function here is protection and secretion. So you have it lining body surfaces, body organs, lining body structures. Your connective tissue is going to have a different major function, and we're going to look at that. Muscle, its major function, of course, will be for movement. And then nervous tissue, its major function will be for communication. Right? Connective tissue is a little bit trickier because it's the type of tissue that's going to have the most diverse number of functions and the most diverse types and variety of tissue. So let's look at that. So your connective tissue is going to be the most abundant and widely distributed type of tissue in your body. Okay, it's going to be highly vascular, and this means that it has blood. Now you're going to see that not every single type of connective tissue is vascular. There's actually going to be some types of connective tissue that are not vascular, but the majority of connective tissue is vascular, and it can help to provide blood to that epithelium. So if you remember epithelial tissue, one of its characteristics is avascular. It does not have its own blood supply. So it needs to receive blood supply from the tissues underneath it. So for instance, if we were looking at a layer of simple cuboidal tissues, remembering that epithelial tissue is named by both the type of cell, or the shape of cell, I should say, and the number of layers. So this guy here would be a simple cuboidal because it looks like cube-shaped cells, but there's only one layer of them. Okay, so you're looking at 5 different cells that are held tightly by junctions, and they are cube-shaped and 1 layer thick. This side up here, let's make this the apical layer, so it's falling into the free surface area, and this layer, let's call it the basement layer. So if this is the basement layer, it's not going to be free. It's not going to contain empty space. Instead, it's going to have something beneath it. Okay, and this something beneath it is connective tissue. And this connective tissue will provide the nutrients to that epithelial tissue, since the epithelial tissue is avascular. Okay, so that's a main function of your connective tissue, is to provide also nutrients to epithelial tissue. Because this is the most varied group of the tissue types, it's also going to have the greatest variety of functions. So some of those functions can be for support, some can be for protection, some will be for insulation, like your adipose tissue or your fatty tissue, and then some will be for transportation. And here you can think of things like blood. So blood is a type of tissue. We tend to think of blood as just liquid. It's actually a type of tissue that is a liquidy type of tissue instead of solid or semi-solid type of tissue. Under protection and support, you can also find bone, for instance. There's also a type of connective tissue. Okay, so how are connective tissues going to be determined? Well, all connective tissue is going to have 3 key things. So if you remember, epithelial tissue was identified by 2 key things: shape of the cell and number of layers. This is going to be different for connective tissue because connective tissue is so varied that the cells can take so many different shapes and There's not a specific layering. Instead, what you have are three key characteristics. You're going to have a type of cell that's found in that connective tissue. You're going to have a ground substance or matrix, also called your ECM. And then you're going to have fibers. Right? So your specialized cells will generally be ending in blast or cyst. They're suffix. So for instance, you have fibroblast. Okay, that means a blast means a newly formed cell, and fibro means fibrous. So the type of fiber that this guy provides is a very fibrous type of tissue. Okay. Fundamental cell types are going to be your fibroblasts, your chondroblast, your osteoblast, and your stem cells. So we're going to look in a little bit more detail on these. Your ground substance or matrix, also known as your ECM. This you'll see a lot, ECM, because it's extracellular matrix. So one of the cool things about connective tissue is they create their own living space. It's like they make their own house in which they're going to live. Bone cells make what are called lacunae. So if I'm a bone cell with my nuclei, I actually make like a lazy boy. I always call it a lazy boy around me, which is the space in which I'm going to live. So the cell is that little guy in there, but then everything around it is actually the house in which it lives. And it's a solid house because it's bone. Blood cells make a liquidy substance in which they're going to live. So blood makes a liquid or fluid extracellular matrix so that it can travel easily through your blood vessels. So what is blood or plasma actually made from? It's the extracellular matrix of those cells. Okay. And then the fibers are going to be how that is made. So all connective tissue uses fibers to make its extracellular matrix in which it's going to live. But those fibers will be different depending on what type they're going to make. So the fibers can be very prominent. You can have a lot of fibers. You can have fibers that are made of a harder substance. You can have fibers that are made of looser substance, etc. So a few things to keep in mind. Your ECM can also contain things called GAGs, proteoglycans, and glycoproteins. Don't worry too much about that. Basically, these are all different substances that are found in your grounds, in your extracellular matrix, that allow it to be more liquidy or less liquidy, that allow it to be harder or looser or softer, that allow it to be more flexible or more elastic, whatever it is that you need. The three key types of fibers that we look at with regards to connective tissue are going to be collagen, elastic fibers, and reticular fibers. And for each of the types of tissue, we'll look at what types of fibers they actually are containing. All right, so keeping in mind, epithelial tissue was classified by shape and layers. Connective tissue will be classified by the type of cell, the type of extracellular matrix, and the type of fibers. All right. So the way we classify connective tissue, because it is so varied, is we'll classify it into three groups. So group 1 is your connective tissue proper. Group 2 are your fluid. And group 3 is your supportive. So under fluid, you're going to have blood and you're going to have lymph. Lymph is related to blood, and it's a type of liquid that is found between the organs of your body. And we'll look at, or you will look at, lymphatic fluid in much more detail in 169 when you get into looking at the lymphatic system and immunity. Okay. Blood, as you very well know, carries nutrients to and from different parts of the body, so it needs to be in a liquid form. Our connective tissue proper will include things like our areolar tissue, right here, also known as loose tissue. And yes, you can use areolar and loose interchangeably. Your adipose tissue is your fatty tissue, so it actually contains the lipids and fat cells. Your reticular tissue is used a lot for immunity. Don't worry, we're going to look at each one of these in detail. And then you have something called dense tissue because it's high in fibers. And those can be divided into regular, dense regular, and dense irregular. Okay. So under the connective tissue proper, we are looking at 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 types of tissue. Under fluid, we're looking at 1, 2 types of tissue, and under supportive, we're looking at 1, 2, 3, 4 types of tissue. So you can see here that we have 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11 types of connective tissue we're going to be looking at. In your labs and in your lecture, you're going to be going through a whole lot more work to get you familiarized with and learn these different types of tissue. All right, so let's start with the first of these types of tissue. This one is your areolar or loose type of connective tissue. And so here you can see that arrangement that I talked about. Remember that there are 3 things that categorize connective tissue. The first being the type of cells. And so all of these types of cells that you're looking at here, the cells are highlighted in a darker color. So all of these cells are actually fibroblasts. Okay. And they will make an extracellular matrix that is solid but loose. Get it? For loose, areolar or loose tissue, it's solid but loose so that it can attach things, but isn't attaching them so strongly that it doesn't have any space to move or for things to get by. And you can also see those fibers here. You can see them here, like all of these little guys. These are the fibers that you're seeing. You can see them more closer here in the image on the right. This is more like what it will look like under the microscope for most of our tissue slides. You can see all these lines are those types of tissue. Those types of fiber that it has. It's very fibrous tissue. All right. And then the other thing that you notice is basically all the background space around the fibers and the cells or the nuclei that you're seeing dark. All the blank space in between and around it where everything is contained is your extracellular matrix or your ECM. Okay. So this is what loose connective tissue looks like under the microscope, or your areolar tissue. And so when you look at it, you will notice that it's going to be very fibrous, interspersed with cells around it, and that it will usually, basically that's what it's going to look like. Where do you tend to find your areolar tissue? Right underneath epithelial tissue. So this is the type of tissue that provides the most nutrients to your epithelial tissues. This guy is key. So where you tend to have epithelial tissue, like we looked at before with your simple cuboidal, for instance, right underneath it, under the basement layer, you would have this type of connective tissue, this areolar connective tissue, interspersed, lots of fibers interspersed, like that. When we get into the integument portion, looking at the skin, you'll see how you're always going to have that loose connective tissue right under the upper epithelial tissue layer. Okay, so the reason that this type of connective tissue is called areolar or loose connective tissue is because since it's right underneath the epithelial tissue, which is lining body surfaces and organs, then you need to have a good amount of protection. So this guy is loose. It's going to have the fibers loosely placed so that you can have fibroblasts around it, but you can also have a lot of other cells. So you'll have cells like mast cells, plasma cells, macrophages. What these guys primarily do, white blood cells, what these guys do is that they kill and remove debris and pathogens. So if you think about your skin, you scrape your skin and any debris that could possibly get past that initial epithelial layer will hopefully be grabbed and destroyed by all of these different cells that are found within your loose areolar tissue. So that's the reason for you having that loose tissue. It also allows for good spaces for all of those blood vessels. You need all these spaces for blood vessels because remember, since it's attached right beneath your epithelial tissue and your epithelial tissue is avascular, so then this type of loose connective tissue needs to be highly vascular so that it can provide nutrients to your epithelial layer. All right, the next type of tissue we're going to talk about is adipose tissue. Adipose tissue looks like nothing else, so it should be fairly easy to identify under the microscope. This is generally what it looks like here. It looks like a bunch of blank spaces with pink towards the making like round circles. So each one of these here is one cell. That's one cell. And the reason the pink is highlighted is because there's so much fat in the cell, because it is a fat tissue. Since there's so much fat, it actually pushes most of those organelles and nuclei to the edges of the cell. And that's why it looks like the cell is being outlined, because the staining that we use for this type of tissue outlines DNA and other structures. And so that's why you see it squished around the edges. Okay, so here's what some images, not images, would look like. This is illustrations down here of it, and you can see how the nuclei and a lot of organelles are going to be pushed to the edges. The space in the middle is mostly going to be fat reservoirs. Okay, so why do we have fat reservoirs? Obviously, the logical answer would be energy reserve. We need a reserve. You all know that what you eat, whatever you do not immediately burn, has to be reserved in the form of fat in your body. This is especially important when you're a baby and an infant, because you need so much energy to grow and do all your things that you're going to eat a lot, and reserve a lot of fatty tissue, which is why babies look so chunky cute. As we get older, we should be consuming close to what we're burning, so that way we have less fat tissue reserve. And of course, it depends on our metabolism and what we eat, whether to determine how much energy reserves we're going to have. It also helps with cushioning, and it also helps with thermoregulation. And so we're going to look at this in more detail when we get into the integument system, which is your skin, your organ system of the skin. And you'll see how that organ system will have a lot of fatty tissue towards the bottom to help cushion every time you bang into things, and to help you maintain the heat or cooling of the body. All right, I'm going to pause here before continuing on with the other 9 types of connective tissue, since we're already gone a little bit long in this video, and then we'll continue with the rest of the types of tissue on the second video.